Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back. I am someone, or you are someone, and I am someone else. And today, I have a road to serfdom. The road to serfdom. And it is fantastic. I've read this entire book. I don't really understand most of it because some of it's in German, some of it's in a lot of analogies in English. But one thing that it is it's an anti-socialist manifesto. And my favorite part of the manifesto is chapter 10, Why the Worst Get on Top. And the reason, here's the thing, right? People like to vote for more government control, right? You may or may not agree with this statement, whatever, right? But just hear me out, right? I'm an anti-socialist because not only because of this book, but this book is very good. This book's actually written to socialists and socialist parties, which is that's who this book is addressed to. People who think socialism is a good idea in any sense of the word. This is what the book's for. Anyway, that's besides the point. The road to serfdom, his argument is, in chapter 10 anyway, that if you vote for more government power and then you have somebody else in the steering wheel who's bad, you've already voted in all the power. Now all someone has to do is turn on the keys of the ignition and basically start going. Start controlling people's income. Because if you ask for your income to be controlled by the government, well, what do you think an evil person's going to do? They're going to force you to work for a different company. The ideal is to have as little government intervention in your income as possible and have as little taxes as possible, obviously, because he thinks you should have freedom of choice in where your money goes. And that's what I love about this book. It really does say that individualism advocates for the total amount of freedom, and people don't seem to realize that they want the government to control their. Well, at that point, you're just doing day in, day out. Somebody else is controlling your life. Someone else is controlling your job. Someone else is controlling where your money goes. You can only eat certain things. You can only, eventually, because now they control all the production. And you're a serf. And that's why it's called A Road to Serfdom. It talks about 1944. The book was written in 1944. It doesn't talk a lot about the Soviets, but it talks more about the Germans and the Italians and what they did in the 1930s in order to make everyone into serfs. And it is a fantastic book at explaining why the Italians and the Germans turned into serfs and why the Soviet Union will eventually turn into serfs as well. And it did. They did. And this book is fantastic. However, I do not recommend this book for the average reader. This book is very hard to read. Very, very hard to read. I would probably not recommend this. If your language is your first language is English, or I mean, if your second language is English, do not buy this book. Try to find a better book that's anti-socialist. This book is okay. It's a manifesto against socialism. I have another book that is far better, Capitalism and Freedom, by Milton Friedman. This book is way better, I think, if for an English speaker. If you want to learn English, this is the book you should read. It's very simple compared to the other one. It doesn't use as many metaphors. The other one uses a lot more metaphors. I like the other one because of the quotes. So every chapter in the book, there's a quote, and it talks about freedom and the difference between freedom and economics. And I think it's fantastic. This book, I mean, The Road to Serfdom, I think if you really wanted to hear anti-socialist propaganda, or I guess it'd be propaganda, manifesto on why socialism doesn't work all the time, this is fantastic. And, the Germans and Italians didn't know they were voting in terrible people. They just wanted their lives to be better. These people said, oh, we're going to fix everything. And they did. Well, they did do some campaign promises that they said they were going to do. But eventually it made everyone's life worse because then they couldn't pick and choose what they wanted to do. Even if they were in some ways better off before the people got in office, in some ways, and some ways worse when they got in office. Especially in Germany, where a lot of groups of people were killed for believing or looking different from other people. So the Italians, I guess, did the same thing. I don't know how extreme they were. Again, he doesn't go into so much detail on the Italians compared to the Germans, because he is German. The guy who wrote this is from Austria, which is a German-speaking country that was invaded by Germany in World War II. And so that's what I love about this book. He uses a lot of German in this book. So if you don't know German, although I would recommend if you do know German, maybe you should pick up this book because this culturally is very important to German literature as well. But again, a lot of people have been influenced by this book, whether you're talking about Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan. This book has been influential in English speaking culture as well. So even though the guy is originally German, I think the problem with his book is he likes to use a lot of complicated words and a lot of metaphors. And I didn't understand 90% of this book because the metaphors. One of my favorite chapters, chapter 11, he talks about why dictatorships use the word liberty and how liberty can get muddled up with the politics of a dictatorship and why they would allow that word to exist in a dictatorship. And it's a very fantastic book, like a very fantastic chapter on the control of speech, but yet they still use the same words as we do, and how you can easily turn to a dictatorship if you can't figure out that the control of speech is getting more and more extreme, and how speech and politics and economics are all related to each other. And it's just that's what makes this book fantastic. Is it really? It's more political than economic. And the last chapter, chapter 15, how to set up an international economic system, is talking about the Woods Agreement and how the U.S. dollar was going to be the reserve currency back when the book was released. It became the world's reserve currency in, I believe, 1947. Don't quote me on that. 1947 or 1949. I remember being an odd year, but I don't remember which year it was. Anyways, like right after World War II. And the Wood Agreement basically get the U.S. dollar become the world's reserve currency. And he also talked about the League of Nations, which was established, but it failed. And that's how World War II happened, is because the League of Nations failed to keep a world peace. So eventually we got the United Nations. And so, I mean, this book with the last chapter was I like the last chapter because I'm a big fan of international politics. And so for me, that chapter really was like, wow. Like he predicted a lot of the world with that last chapter. And he's one of the smartest people. The problem is his speech is so complicated. He's more talking about college professors and college educated voters than really the average British public. In the book, it's really not made for an American audience. And so when he talks about, think of yourself as a British person, not an American, when you read his book. It's just, but it's made for someone who is a socialist who's in Britain. It's made to address them as most. But the problem is, I feel like his message gets so banged over the top of the head with all these metaphors that he doesn't actually go into real examples other than the two examples, Italy and Germany. He doesn't bring the Soviet Union up because the Soviet Union was their allies in the war in the United Kingdom with in World War II. So I mean that's what makes the book kind of flawed. It's kind of caught in this time frame of World War II. I feel like if he would have waited to write the book, which in some regard, if he would have waited, he probably would have died before the book was published. Then it probably would have worked out a lot better. But because he was stuck in his time frame and he never talked about the Soviets as much, he does in the beginning of the book, but he doesn't talk about it at the end of the book. I feel like he would have achieved a lot more. Again, if you ever are a socialist, especially you're British, I do recommend picking up that book. If you're American, I don't know if I recommend it, but it does have a section on it's like an American edited chapter and says, here's how we edit it for an American audience. And it's a very unique book. The problem is it has like half of the book is this introduction after introduction. There's probably 5 introductions for this one book. That's what I don't really. That's the thing about economics books I've noticed is they seem to have more introduction, and I'm reading a lot more economics books. I'm also reading the Keynesian one, the general employment of what is it? General theory of employment, interest and money. I'm reading that one as well. I disagree with it, but I'm gonna read it just so people. I'm not a big Keynesian. I don't like Keynesian economics, but if I want to understand both sides of the argument. I want to understand Keynesian economics, and I want to understand Austrian economics, and so I'm gonna try to understand the other side. I think I like the philosophy of Austrian. I like Chicago economics too, but those are my three favorite types of economics. So those three I've been reading. And the Keynesians, the Morgan Freeman's more of a Chicagoan thinker, although I could argue that Hayek might be Chicagoan. But they believe in controlling interest rates, and all three sort of have their own ideals on how things should be run. They all have a different philosophy. I think the Chicagoans are more mathematical based than the Austrians, so a lot of ways they can base their stuff on reality, unlike the Austrians. So I can't really. There's not a lot of math with Austrian. It's more theoretical. Um, but anyway, that's besides the point. Why am I bringing a rant on economics? I really shouldn't do that. But I'm reading as much as I can on economics because I want to know, how do you build a society with money? And learning all the history behind it is fascinating, especially with this one being so international. This one's very international. And if you don't it's really kind of stuck in a time capsule, I think. But it says it's more important now than it was when it was written. I don't know how much I agree with that, but I don't think we're at risk of any of this, but what it's saying, the road to serfdom. But you know, it could very well happen. I don't know how close we are to that road to serfdom yet, but I think we're getting closer and closer to it. Like Morgan Freeman says, the GDP spending is up 32% more than that. It's over 50%. In some interviews he's been in, it's weird. He kind of goes up down with 32% to actually 50% of the economy is controlled publicly. And so, like, I don't know, that scares me a little bit. But anyways, besides the point. Maybe you trust the government more than I do. And in that case, you're completely fine. You don't have to worry. But I'm just worried that eventually the division of labor will be completely controlled by people who you don't agree with. So, anyway, yeah, that's besides the point. It's a very interesting book, Road to Serfdom. How you can control and it's also about like price, what do you call it, price increases and price decreases. Like the government wants you to be able to afford a home, but then they're either going to give you a higher wage or they're going to lower the price of homes. So then you run out of homes, and then they have to tell the sellers, oh, you have to sell homes, and you have to build more homes, and they're going to force them to build more homes. And it's like and then you can't just change numbers and expect things to work out. And I feel like a lot of people think they can do that, and they don't understand that economics is all about supply and demand. It's not about, price controlling. Eventually it becomes very, very what do you call it, authoritarian in nature, and it's very interesting the fact that he does talk about that a little bit. He uses a lot of metaphors, and that's the problem. Is like, I'm trying to explain the book without metaphors, and that's the biggest problem I have with this book. It's just too poetic for me. If you like poems, though, I think this book is very quotable. It's just, I don't know how to quote a book with poems. I'm sorry. It's like an economics book with a little bit of politics that's very quotable with poems. And I just don't like poems all that much. So I try my best to explain it without poems. But I'm sure that you can get a lot more from F A Hayek's book than I will, because I'm a terrible reader. I didn't understand half the stuff he was saying in the book, and I read it pretty quickly too. But that's besides the point. I do recommend it, however. If it's just a hard book to read. Let me give it a review. I'm gonna do 6 out of 10 just because of the difficulty of the book. It's actually more difficult, I heard, than a lot of the other economics books. It's probably one of the most difficult ones I've ever. It's probably the most difficult. It's more difficult than Bogle on mutual funds, which is supposedly one of the hardest books ever to read when it comes to what is it, investing. It's one of the harder books to read. So, in that case, I would say no if you have a hard time reading. Other than that, if you're fantastic, if you know every word in the English language and you can optimize your mind to F. A. Hayek's brain, 1944 brain, then I think it would be perfect. Anyway, that's besides. 6 out of 10, perfect for you. Remember, you are someone and I'm someone else, and I'm now doing book reviews for some reason. Just like and subscribe, do whatever. If you hate my book reviews, you can comment down below. Dislike. Nobody looks at the dislikes anymore. YouTube disabled those. He said it was naughty for the creator or whatever. I don't know, but yeah. Goodbye.